Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, Joe and I react to the team introducing both Justin Verlander and Kodai Senga, who clearly wants a piece of the Phillies lineup. We also break down the catching situation after the team signed Omar Narvaez, what other offense could be on the way, Liam Hendricks rumors, and much more. So subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Mets Pod. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo, and the news never stops. We have so much to go through today. And Joe, I got to start with this. It is episode 41 of the Mets Pod. Not only can I can't believe we've made it here, but also a special episode. Kodai Senga is wearing number 34, Noah Syndergaard's number, but I think 41 is a pretty important pitching number in Mets history. So I had to shout that out. And something I bet you didn't know before we sat down for today's show.
Had absolutely no idea. Shows that I really keep track of this kind of stuff, but I had no idea. But 41, obviously, Seaver, we know everything that comes with that. And Kodai Senga wore 41 in Japan. So obviously that wasn't the option here. Like you said, that he chose number 34 after kind of like polling the audience, which was really awesome. And yeah, a couple press conferences here the last couple of days. And I'll tell you, I'm a sucker for a good press conference. Just put the guy in the jersey in the hat, let him answer the kind of simple questions. Don't really care so much about what they say. Just seeing Kodai Senga and Justin Verlander officially in Mets garb just gets me ready for baseball.
I remember during the pandemic, you were all over the please mail them a jersey and a hat for the Zoom press conferences. It's good to see press conferences back in Queens. Obviously, some really big ones for the Mets. And full transparency, Joe, I didn't know it was episode 41 either. Shout out to our great producer, Jeff, who took care of that for us. But obviously, just another big week for the Mets. There's so much happens that you actually forget a couple of things. Let's start with what we know. And I'm glad you highlighted that, Joe. It was really cool to see Kodai Senga kind of embrace being a New York Met. You could tell it was something that he actually put thought into. He didn't seem overwhelmed by the moment, even with the language barrier there, which, let's be honest, for anyone in the world, that can be really tricky. He looked comfortable. He was prepared. He seems excited to share a rotation with some legendary pitchers, and we will get to Justin Verlander in just a bit. So I think Kodai Senga's energy was a really cool way for him to make his introduction as a New York Met.
Oh, the energy was fantastic, and him opening up in English, I think, was an awesome touch.
Totally.
And just think of how like nerve-wracking that must be. Like, he just signed a $75 million contract to play in the biggest city in the United States, leaving Japan, the country he knows, and going in front of all the media that is there for New York. Like, I couldn't imagine going to Japan and doing a press conference and opening it in Japanese. So huge shout out to Kodai for, getting that down, and, LGM and Let's Go Mets and the Big Apple and everything. He touched on all the high points, and you could just tell, like you said, the energy is there. Like, I think Senga's going to bring kind of a youthful energy to a very veteran starting rotation.
I thought so too. I think that, obviously this is somebody, as you've noted many times on this show, who has trained at Driveline in the United States with Yu Darvish. This isn't hey, this is his first time over here. He knows nothing about the major leagues. He's obviously invested into the analytical aspect of pitching and where pitching is going. We know he has big time stuff. There will be key adjustments for Senga down the road, but what a way to start things off for him, who will have a pivotal role in this rotation. And another key press conference, a key introduction that took place in person at Queens, not over Zoom. Justin Verlander, of course. And Verlander has gone to new destinations before. He's pitched under high expectations. He's pitched on big money contracts. The Cy Young from last year, of course, everything that comes with Justin Verlander. Not really too shocking to see his level of comfort. But I will say, Joe, what stood out to me, because it's something that continuously comes up when you hear guys arrive to the Mets that are already established stars, that have a lot of different choices in terms of their next destination for huge contracts. They constantly point back to their interactions with Steve Cohen before a deal was signed. And that was something that Verlander really noted not just during his press conference, but in a one-on-one to SNY Steve Gelbs as well. So, Joe, it's just a continued theme that ownership is playing a huge part in acquiring players with this franchise, marquee players for the Mets.
They're playing a huge role. I mean, when you have these press conferences, everyone thinks ownership. It's kind of like the thing to do, but it's evident that Steve Cohen is taking that extra level of trying to be personal with these players. I mean, we've talked about this before, how Francisco Lindor and Edwin Diaz and everyone's, going to Steve Cohen's house for dinner, which I'd love to go to Steve Cohen's house for dinner. I'm sure the spread is absolutely fantastic.
There's at least one chef there taking care of business. It's not like Steve is pulling things out of the oven, all right?
At least one. But Verlander, I think what really stuck out to me was talking about the Mets' vision, which, I think some people probably roll their eyes a little bit, but Verlander had the choice to go to the Dodgers. Verlander had other options. I'm sure the Yankees were in play to some degree. He chose the Mets based on obviously the moves that were kind of told to him. And kind of what we almost forget is, he mentioned it in the press conference, was it was a bit of a leap of faith for him. I mean, Billy Epler and Steve Cohen told him these grandiose plans of everything they intended to do, but they had not done anything yet. So Verlander had to kind of take them at their word. And obviously they followed through, and just, really excited to get a guy like Justin in here, who I think is he's gonna have a massive impact on the rotation in the locker room. Seeing him with Max again, I think is going to be riveting to watch. And yeah, just all around a really good day for the New York Mets.
Really good day for the Mets. A lot of excitement. A lot of moves just continue to happen. And sometimes the moves that don't happen are still notable news around the Mets. And I think that took place with Steve Cohen's pursuit of Carlos Correa, Joe, who, as we sit here and record, he was supposed to be introduced by the Giants today. That has been postponed for reasons that we don't know. But at the end of the day, reading the details, I know there was a story with the Post that Cohen had quite a few quotes. I'll be honest, Joe, the Mets were much more serious about Correa than not only I expected before the offseason began, but even when the rumors were out there that they had been talking, I looked at it as a situation of, if Correa is looking to land on another bridge kind of deal, this could be a place he goes, because he'll be playing for a team with championship, expectations, next to one of his best friends in Francisco Lindor. He's going to be in a good lineup where he can produce. And then if he has that opt-out again, he can get mega money. And we know the Mets can pay pretty outlandish numbers on the short term in terms of the AAV. But saying all of that, I put that at about a 2% of happening. I knew that Correa would get a monster deal somewhere with the way this market has played out. Turns out, sounds like the Mets were willing to dip their toes into the $300 million range for Carlos Correa, Joe. Did this surprise you as much as it took me? I was totally surprised when I read the details of the aftermath of this.
Very surprised when I read from The Athletic that Ken Rosenthal saying that the Mets had interest in Correa. I kind of took that as Scott Boras is trying to get the deal closed somewhere with Correa.
The man's good at this, Joe.
And they just, need the Mets to push someone along. And then, of course, he signed an hour and a half later, or agreed with the Giants. So I was like, well, that checks out. And then the article from John Heyman from the Post, which if you haven't read it and you're a Mets fan, I highly recommend you do so. It gives you quite a vision into how Steve Cohen is looking at this. Like, this is not finances to him. He simply just wants to win, and he'll spend whatever's necessary. I was absolutely floored when I read that they were willing to go to 13 years and around $300 million. I simply could not believe it. But what it does show is nothing is impossible with the New York Mets now. With Steve Cohen owning this team, at no point should we ever say any player is off limits to the Mets. They're not going to get everybody. We know that. But the fact that Cohen was just like, oh, Correa doesn't seem like he has that hot of a market. Let me just see if I could throw 300 mil his way and see if that'll work. Like, Mets fans should be so thankful that this man is owning this team, and just his commitment to winning basically at any expense. I believe in that article, it even said that he's slated to potentially lose upwards of $100 million in profit, and he doesn't care. So it's definitely a great thing to see the Mets just being in on everything.
And you know what helps for a bigger profit, Joe? When the team wins games and when the team matters and when the team is cared about on a national level, not just the New York City market, which is unbelievable, but on the national level. And I think Steve Cohen is willing to play the short-term game for the benefit of the long-term game, for the brand. And this is something you and I have discussed a lot. The New York Mets brand is in a totally different stratosphere on this day that we sit here and record compared to where it was 3 years ago. And, you know, two quotes that really stuck out to me that I thought were jarring in this piece. The first one was regarding the tax. It's only another 20 cents, Cohen said. It wasn't like all or nothing. You have to decide. You either pay it or you don't. And the other one was, I've been dealing with big numbers for so long. These numbers don't scare me at all. It's not like I'm not respectful about what these other teams have to deal with. This is a man that this kind of financial impact coming from the industry he still is in today at a very, very significant tier, it's just not overwhelming to him. It's just the money moves over and now you're playing the game of sports. You're playing the game of baseball. It's a hobby, but it's something that he's also experiencing and understanding, moving money around and what investments might be worth the long-term risk or output. So really crazy stuff. And that kind of leads us to, you know, what is next for this Mets team, I think, because they don't get Correa. I don't think anybody's angry or upset. I think everybody's pretty understanding overall. But there are still other options on the table. Michael Conforto's out there. I know Rosenthal has connected the Mets, the Rangers, and the Blue Jays to Conforto consistently for the last week. We've heard rumors of Liam Hendricks. Wonder where people heard that for the first time. I know the Mets pod was a big fan of that idea. Good call out, Joe. If Hendricks is on the market, more in terms of shedding the money. There's kind of some irony there. We know how the White Sox owner felt about Steve Cohen getting involved in baseball and the fact where how those chips can line up. So, Joe, when you look at this, let's start with Conforto first, or any other bat. What should the Mets' priorities be? Because it does seem like there is a bit of motivation for this lineup to still improve despite what they've already done and what they expect from the young guys.
I've spent some time thinking on this, and there's a few bats out there. I think Trey Mancini would fit with this team. I think Adam Duvall would fit with this team. Brandon Drury could fit with this team. AJ Pollock could fit here. Like, there's quite a few right-handed bats. But I've been thinking, like, what the Mets don't have to sign a right-handed bat. They could sign Michael Conforto, who I think has the highest offensive upside of those group of players that I mentioned. And Mark Canha could become that right-handed fourth outfielder / DH. And yeah, it's expensive, but like Steve Cohen said,
does that matter anymore? Especially in the 1 year window?
Yeah, you're either spending it or you're not. And obviously, I think Conforto's health is something we're not aware of. I know that they're in his piece for the Athletic, Ken Rosenthal said there are some teams questioning if Conforto is good throwing the ball, and Boris says he's in line with everybody else. So you'd certainly have to dive into the medicals. But if those check out, and you're looking to add upside and you're looking to add pop to this lineup, Michael Conforto has been a 25-30 home run guy at the major league level. And none of the other guys, I guess Adam Duvall has had it semi-recently, but Conforto's a much more complete player. And if you're trying to up the ceiling of this team offensively, I think Conforto gives you that best opportunity. And then Mark Canha has played some center field, so he could be that fourth outfielder that has all three outfield spots. And, you know, you could throw him in against some left-handed pitching at DH. It just increases the flexibility, the versatility, and obviously the potential output of this offense.
I think there's a couple things to break down here. One, there's some things we can't, right? You and I don't know if Conforto can throw or not today. And that's a gigantic variable because if you add Conforto, you aren't just adding Conforto to sit in the DH spot every day. Yeah, this is not what you're doing. Can you do that? Sure. Will you do that? Yeah. But you love the idea of Conforto in the aspect of, man, this saves Marte's legs. This can save, in a pinch, Nimmo's legs. If Marte has to play center in a spot here, or Canha has to play center in a spot here, to give Nimmo some. There's the idea of Conforto is intriguing because outfield versatility and what he can do as the lineup, not one exclusively, just the outfield versatility or just the aspect of the bat. And I think, of course, when you look at Conforto and wonder, how would he profile into this lineup where he's not under the magnifying glass as much as we were used to seeing. When you have plenty of star talent around him, whether it is Marte, whether it is obviously Lindor, who was much more comfortable last year. And can you find Conforto in a more favorable matchup situation, right? I think that helps as well. So there is upside to Conforto, who the last time he was on the New York Mets in 2021, the 729 OPS and the 14 home runs, of course, it was disappointing. But when you look at Conforto from 2017 to 2019, I mean, that's a guy that had an OPS of 939, 797, 856, and he hit home runs from 27 to 33 in those 3 years. He was 27 plus home runs every year. So the upside of Conforto, Joe, is very, very intriguing. And when you look at the structure of the contract, even if you do have a little bit of questions overall of where his health status is at, I don't think there will be ultimately a ton of risk in what his deal looks like at the end of the day, unless the Texas Rangers just do something absolutely stupid again, which they've shown they're very, very capable of.
Scott Boras has made it pretty clear that Conforto is looking at either a bloated 1-year deal or a 2-year deal with an opt-out after the first year, which we've seen a lot of this offseason. And Conforto's a good defensive player as well. So, sure. I mean, he's got the throwing arm if it's healthy and good and the shoulder's good, but you put him in left field where the throwing arm is not as much of a focus. So if you have Conforto in left, Nimmo in center, Marte in right, that's a heck of a defensive outfield. And you bring that offensive thump that this team wants. I mean, we've talked about this. They need some power. And, Adam Duvall could hit some home runs, but that's all Adam Duvall could do. He's not going to hit for average. He's not going to get on base. He's either going to hit home runs or basically get out. That is what Adam Duvall brings to the table. And there could be value to that if Conforto doesn't want to come here, which is obviously a factor. Is this the place where Michael Conforto wants to, reestablish his value? Well, maybe not. But at the same time, how many free agents over the last year have we talked about not wanting to come to New York that ended up in New York? Max Scherzer wasn't going to want to be a Met. Justin Verlander wasn't want to be a Met. A lot of people are saying about Conforto, but maybe Steve Cohen and Billy Epler can convince him that this is a good spot to reestablish yourself. He feels like he fits prime in like the 5 spot in the lineup. And the right field fences are coming in a little bit, a few feet. So that could help with some of his power output. And yeah, I think a lot of Met fans are just thinking of how long it's been since Conforto has been that premium player that you spoke about. So there's risk, but like you said, it's mitigated by it being a short-term commitment. And, it's a roll of the dice for upside. And I think they have enough floor in this lineup that they can afford it.
And you do wonder, what can the matchup situation do, right? I think you and I particularly really like Escobar and Canna against lefties. And the fact the Mets have that insurance, that added bonus, that added flexibility, versatility on this lineup, something that did not really exist during many of the Wilpon years of the last decade plus. I mean, Conforto's a guy where predominantly, if you put him in against righties, he's raked against righties his entire career. It's basically been Michael Conforto. I mean, his splits against righties in his career, 873 OPS, 371 on base, 502 slugging. That's excellent against righties. And it's a huge offensive, boost for this Mets team. So there is an aspect of it where you're not looking at the Conforto that was a Met. You're looking at the Conforto of this new Mets kind of team under Buck with a deeper roster. And I do want to get into the Liam Hendricks conversation, Joe, because this is a reliever that's been very intriguing to us on the show. It is now official that he's been connected to the Mets a little bit. The first I saw, and I know you tweeted this, was Andy Martino on SNY saying it, and John Heyman has tweeted about it as well. Hendricks obviously has been one of the best relievers in baseball for quite some time now. When you look at Hendricks from 2019, he's been, a sub-3 ERA guy. 2 of those seasons, it's a sub-2 ERA guy. The K over 9 is 13 plus every single year. Huge strikeout pitcher. Not coming here. If he did come here, not coming here with the expectations to be in any kind of closing role, even though he has a ton. He's cleared 37 plus saves over the last 2 years, right? 38 and 37 over the last 2 years. But we know where the Mets are right now with Edwin Diaz at the top. David Robertson has been added. Now you're talking about a 7th through 9th inning bridge, Joe, if this happens, that championship teams dream about.
dating back to 2020, the two leaders amongst relievers in baseball in Fangraphs WAR are Edwin Diaz and Liam Hendricks, top two in baseball. So hypothetically, you're looking at having two of, if you want to throw Josh Hader in the mix, two of the top 3 to 4 relievers in the sport in the same bullpen. This is absolutely something the Mets should pursue. The White Sox are apparently listening. I don't know what they're looking for. Are they looking for big league contributors and more to, stay on a contending window in a sort of wide open AL Central? So does Carlos Carrasco intrigue them? Could they use a guy like that in their bullpen, where maybe the Mets do Carrasco and something for Hendricks, and the Mets could slide David Peterson or Tyler McGill into the 5 spot, or heck, go back into free agency and sign Michael Wacha or someone like that that's out there that's still, a possible back end guy. It increases obviously your flexibility, what you can do in free agency and in the rotation. And then you kind of build that super back end of a bullpen. And, like you said, Hendricks' numbers speak for themselves. He's owed 2 years and $29 million. So I think that probably suppresses what his trade value is to a degree. If they actually want to move him, there's only so many teams that are probably willing to take on, call it $15 million a year in a reliever. The Mets are in a prime position to do so. So whether that's using someone like Carrasco, like I mentioned, or maybe, using some of the minor league depth and not your top guys. Like, I don't think it's you're not going to be talking, Jet Williams, or probably not even Ronnie Mauricio. You're taking a step lower than that. Is that worth it for a team that's really going for it? I think it could be. And Hendricks to Diaz certainly could be dynamic. And don't forget too, Buck Showalter has not been afraid to use Edwin Diaz in the 8th inning where matchups warrant it. So if he does do that, in the 9th inning, you have a certified closer ready to close out the 9th inning. So it just adds so much to this team being able to add someone like Hendricks.
And good call on the contract, because a lot of people will think of Hendricks signing that 3-year deal and think this is an expiring deal. A reminder that there's a club option in 2024 that if he is traded, that option vests. So when you're looking at it, and even so, it was a $15 million buyout. So Hendricks is essentially on a 4-year deal where the money escalated every single season. So he would be on essentially kind of a 2-year, $28 to $30 million contract for the Mets here. So that's why, if you're sitting here wondering, why would the White Sox do this? One of the best relievers in baseball, one of the best closers in baseball, unless they were getting a significant return. The financial aspect is huge here. They're basically trying to unload money from a position that maybe they don't value as highly as many other teams would, or maybe they simply just think that Hendricks going into his age 34 and 35 seasons does not warrant that kind of payday, while for a championship, hopefully a championship caliber roster would see him differently. So definitely a big time rumor to keep an eye on. One more thing before we get to the mailbag, because it's all this stuff going on, and the Mets did sign another player. I've never seen something pass through the news cycle of the Mets quicker than this, in terms of what, where did this come from? Why did they do this? What does this mean? And then it was gone. Nobody talked about it. Omar Narvaez, a catcher from the Brewers, who got a good deal from the Mets, Joe. I mean, this was in no way any kind of a laugher of a deal. Narvaez is a 30-year-old catcher, a veteran catcher. He gets essentially a 2-year deal. 2024 is that player option, but this year it's structured as a 1-year, $8 million deal. Last year, only hit 4 home runs, hit 206, is regarded and has been regarded over very recent seasons as becoming one of the best pitch framers in all of baseball, something that for Narvaez kind of came out of nowhere after starting his career with the White Sox. He had a season in Seattle. He gets to Milwaukee, where he had an all-star season in 2021 out of nowhere while really improving at the catcher position. Joe, I know this surprised us. Number one, I just want to know what you think of Narvaez. And two, now how do you read the Mets catching situation that is very, very crowded and quietly very expensive?
So I still think they're pushing a James McCann trade, and I won't be surprised if at some point before we report to Port St. Lucie, James McCann's no longer on this team one way or another. But I think what this does is it makes me think that Francisco Alvarez might be starting the season in AAA. And maybe this means the Mets are going to push hard for a Conforto or a Mancini or a more meaningful offensive addition at the DH/outfield role, because let's call it what it is. An Omar Narvaez, Tomas Nido platoon is not much by the way of offense. Narvaez has hit righties in his career. I believe his OPS is around 730 or 740 for his career against righties. So he can hit a little bit, but the Mets signed these guys for their defense. Narvaez and Nido both rank inside the top 7 in baseball in pitch framing in 2022. So I think the plan probably is, let's get offense elsewhere, and let's, for now, while Alvarez continues to develop defensively at the minor league level, use defense behind the plate to support Verlander, Scherzer, the adjustment for a guy like Kodai Senga, and then obviously down to Quintana and Carrasco, et cetera. So it's an interesting approach, and something the Astros did. Not to say the rest of the Mets lineup is quite comparable to the rest of the Astros lineup, but I believe the Astros catchers this year had an OPS of like 590 something. So they punted offense at catcher, went defense, and it appears, at least as of now and on the surface, that's what the Mets plan is for at least the early going in 2023.
It makes sense. And with Narvaez, last year, he didn't really hit much of anyone. All 4 of his home runs came against right-handed pitching. But you're right, Joe. For his career, he's had a 751 OPS against righties. So it's almost essentially, it's not Vogelback levels, right? But you do not want him taking at-bats against lefties. You just don't. I can never envision a scenario where he should be starting against a left-handed pitcher when Nido is on the roster. It's really that simple. So you're all over it that this is a catching platoon. The Mets have a good God platoon, Jets. We're all over the place here on today's show. They have a situation where it's just you're waiting for Alvarez because you know that he just has by far a ceiling that these guys aren't even sniffing at this point. So you're trying to get to that point while also not sacrificing any defense for a staff. So I have no problem with the strategy. Do I think this is a great move or some outside the box clever decision? No, I really shrugged my shoulders. If the Mets were a team that can't really spend a lot of money, we would hate this move because it's not a laugher in terms of finances. But for the Mets, any deal that's in that 1 to 2 year range, the floor of it being a disaster almost doesn't really exist for those kinds of moves anymore. Right, Joe?
Yeah, and I really hope, too, that they are not planning on having Alvarez on the big league roster as that DH. I think that would be a complete detriment to his development. So if Narvaez and Nido are going to be your catchers on opening day, you don't need to carry 3 catchers. Put Alvarez in Syracuse where, if they make no more moves in the rotation, it's possible the AAA rotation has David Peterson, has Tyler McGill, has Joey Lucchesi, has Eliezer Hernandez in it. So
Major league pitchers.
He'd be catching big league pitchers and furthering his development. And then when the Mets feel he's ready defensively, he could come up and he could take those at-bats away from Tomas Nido. And at that point, you could probably pull off the 3 catcher thing. But if the focus is on defense, I entirely understand. So let's send Alvarez back. Let's let him get that necessary development because we forget he's 20, turning 21 years old. This is a kid that a catcher at his age is typically in low A. So he's catching up just on the development cycle, and his bat is so advanced that there's a reason why he's on the cusp of the big league. So I think this would be advantageous for the Mets to consider the long term with Alvarez by sending him back.
Man, is Syracuse going to be a wagon next year, Joe? They're coming off a tough couple seasons. It feels like they're going to be a wagon next year.
Beatty, Vientos, Mauricio, Alvarez, they can realistically all be there.
All right. We'll keep an eye on them as we always do. And a reminder, you're listening to the Mets Pod. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can check out SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's get into the mailbag. Joe, your tweets just take off every single week and a lot of really, really good questions. I picked this one first because I knew it'd be a good extension of the Senga conversation. This is from Mets Giants 2000. Is it realistic to expect Senga to be a number 3 starting pitcher on a win-now team when the team's number 3 last year was Bassett, who even got Cy Young votes in 2021 with Oakland? It just feels like Epler is taking a lot of risk with this signing. Joe, do you agree?
He is. I mean, that's an undeniable fact. You're taking a risk here, but it is a more educated and calculated risk than I think people are giving credit for. Epler said after that press conference when he was talking to the media that he had been scouting Kodai Senga since 2013. So he spent plenty of time in Japan. We've talked about him with Ohtani and everything there. Epler spent a lot of time scouting. So Kodai Senga is not like, this was not just some impulsive move this offseason. Like, we just got to dive into the Japanese market, and this kid looks like the best one here, so let's just sign him and, cite his upside, which is there. Like, it's a fastball that'll touch triple digits, the ghost fork ball. He's got some work on his slider and his command, but he's got the repertoire to be that mid-rotation starter. Does not come without risk, but I do believe the Mets are as informed as anyone in baseball is about what Kodai Senga brings to the table, just because of Epler's long-standing I don't want to say relationship, but scouting experience of looking at this guy. I mean, imagine scouting someone for a decade and then feeling like you don't know what they're all about. So I think the Mets know what they're getting themselves into with Senga, and the risk is there, but the upside, obviously is massive.
I also want to be fair here for a second. I think it's a great question, but I think it illuminates a point that we've tried to make on this show that I think a lot of the national media around baseball has consistently missed, while it's driven Mets fans, reporters, analysts, anybody associated with the team, probably a little nuts on the inside. Yes, we look at it and say Bassett was the number 3 last year. Joe, how many months, not days, not weeks, months, was this team without their number 1, Jacob deGrom, their number 2 in Max Scherzer, where Chris Bassett was pushed all the way to the top of the rotation, and the fact that I think Quintana is not looked at as the number 5 that Taijuan Walker was at times. I think Quintana is looked at a guy that can get you by in a pinch as a number 3 or a number 4. So in a vacuum, right? Senga's risky. There's tons of risk with Senga. How is his body going to adjust the MLB schedule? Durability is a huge question. The mental aspect, which we're a little higher on, especially recently, but that's a huge adjustment for any human being. All of these different things. But the insurance they've put around Senga going into this year feels a little different than what they were asking of Bassett last year, where the team won over 100 games.
For sure. I definitely agree with that. And, hopefully you don't have the same injury issues with Max and Verlander that you did with Max and deGrom here in 2022. But, we talked about it on the show last week. They're 10 deep right now with justifiably reasonable guys that could take the ball in a Major League Baseball game. And it's not, no offense to Jared Eichhoff, but it's not Jared Eichhoff. It's guys that actually have a chance to potentially, do damage on that given day to get you 5 innings of 3-run ball or whatever. And with guys like Peterson and McGill and Lucchesi, the ceiling's probably even a little higher than that. So I think they are well prepared for what's necessary with Senga. If in the early going, maybe you give him an extra day here and there. So it's not like a true 6-man rotation per se, but maybe you space out Senga starts a little bit as he gets acclimated to the American game. Because obviously in Japan, you pitch essentially once a week. Like it's much like college baseball here in America, where like Senga was the Hawks Friday night starter. So he just pitched every Friday night. That's when he pitched. And he would throw a lot of pitches. So they're ready for workloads. That's one thing you can say about most Japanese pitchers who come over. They're prepared from a pitch count standpoint to go 90, 100 pitches. It's just the adjustment of going potentially like twice in a week instead of just once a week.
All right, I'm going to package these two together because they are targeting the same topic, and brace yourself. First one from Vincenzo Basil, who said, Joe, if we were prepared to go $300,000, $300 million, 300,000 would be a hell of a bargain.
Yeah.
$300 million for Correa, and he did put 300K. So it was a reading error and typing error. We all have them. $300 million for Correa. Think we'd ask similar for Devers if we trade for him. Then that Met guy who said, no one will come out and say it, which is kind of ironic here, but we know the Mets are eyeing the Devers negotiations closely. If you compare the Devers with Lindor's package minus Cookie, what are your thoughts on this package? McGill, Tidwell, and Parada for Devers. So let's have the big conversation, Joe. Rafael Devers, monster bat, third baseman for the Red Sox, who are letting a lot of stars walk out that door lately. Pretty stunning to see. What do you think of him as a player, as a next big fish acquisition? And two, does that package that Met guy came up with kind of align with your expectations?
The Red Sox cannot possibly trade Rafael Devers. They
Pretty
can't
tough.
do it. I mean, after trading Mookie Betts, after letting Xander Bogaerts walk out the door, they have to just do whatever they have to do to keep Rafael Devers. I think, I know that it's out there that they're, really far apart on negotiations, but all it takes is, the Red Sox to move a little closer and then, you can make a deal. But those are the Red Sox 3 franchise players. Cannot possibly let all 3 go and can't trade 2 of them. But in a hypothetical world that Rafael Devers is available, I mean, that seems like a pretty fair package. That's a first-round pick, McGill. That's a first-round pick, a second-round pick, and then a big league starter for a third baseman who is a fantastic player. He would fit right in the middle of this lineup and provide that 30 home run thump that you're looking for. Not so much of a defensive player, but good enough to play the position. And then on top of that, you have to throw him $300 million, like you're talking with Correa. So, is it something the Mets probably talked to Boston about? I would be shocked if they did not. But if the Red Sox trade Rafael Devers, oh man, does Chaim Bloom have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? There is smoke around this, to be fair. Now,
Yeah.
The most recent is from earlier this week. June Lee, who covers baseball for ESPN. I used to work with June, and he does a great job. And his exact, the headline of his story, or the way he tweeted it out, was Bloom said the Red Sox are willing to go beyond reason to get a deal done, but there are limitations. June also said sources say the Red Sox and Devers are, in quotes, galaxies apart. And while I don't expect them to lose Devers, I think we said the same about Mookie Betts. I think there was probably a time where you didn't feel that way about Xander Bogaerts, who I think that contract was insane in my eyes, but that's another conversation for another team, for another day. I think there are good reason to sit here and if you're Devers, right, and you look at the Mets are a perfect example, but look at what the contracts the Padres have given out. Look at what the Giants just did with Correa. It's not just the Mets. If you're Devers, who I believe Bogaerts was his best friend, you're in a team where they just let your best friend walk. There's, let's say, 5 teams out there, maybe more, that are willing to pay the moon for premium talent, especially a premium talent in their mid to late 20s. Why would you move an inch to satisfy the Red Sox? I wouldn't.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And, I don't know his desires to remain in Boston. Aaron Judge wanted to stay with the Yankees. I'm not comparing Judge to Devers. Sure. He played hardball to get the contract he wanted, but at the end of the day, he always wanted to stay with the Yankees. Maybe Devers is something similar, but man, it is very hard to envision the Red Sox trading him and being able to justify that to their fan base, which, we know how the Boston fan base is. They're rabid, just like New York fans are. They want to win. But man, if Devers is available, the Mets should be making the call and they should be trying to put together a package for him. But at the same time, you also want to think long term. Is paying Devers $300 million, does that take you out of Shohei Ohtani next year? Maybe the answer is no to that. Nothing's impossible here with the Mets, but at some point in time, there's not going to be $300 million deals on top of each other here. So Devers fits for what the Mets are looking to do right now, which is win. It almost feels fantasy baseball-y to me in a sense.
I think it's fair. I think we're not there yet, right?
Right.
I think we're just not there yet. I appreciate the questions. I think they're fair questions. I think us as a show are not full. Like, we had conversations about Lindor maybe 2 months leading up to that trade where the writing was on the wall. Cleveland was not going to pay Francisco Lindor, and he had to go somewhere, and the Mets were that destination. We don't know if that's the Red Sox yet, but we will keep our eyes on it. Let's do one more here. This is from Matthew, who said, out of all of the rookies that the Mets will put out next season, Senga, Alvarez, Beatty, and he asked if Beatty's still eligible for Rookie of the Year, which I believe he is.
Yeah, I think so.
He said, which rookie do you think will be the Mets, rookie of the year? I know people probably think this is like, there's a low-hanging fruit answer of Senga here. I think this is a lot more fascinating than just that, because the spectrum of Alvarez there's more variance with Alvarez than maybe most players in all of baseball. He could spend 5 months in Syracuse next year, and I'd be like, yeah, he just turned 21. He needs to get better at catching, and the Mets like their insurance at catcher and didn't want to push him. He could be up by May and hit 25 home runs next year, and Senga could be a very average number 4, number 5 pitcher, and I'd be like, yeah, okay, I'm not shocked. I think this is pretty tricky, and that's with completely writing off Brett Baty, who in spots last year had some moments before he got hurt.
There's wide spectrums for all these players, obviously. I think Senga, like you said, is probably the easy answer because we know he is the number, starting the season probably as the number 3.
Right?
Yeah, he has the opportunity where he's going to be in this rotation for the entire year as long as he's healthy. Alvarez, it could be a lot of things. Like, I think it's a bad idea for him to be the DH on opening day. That doesn't mean the Mets agree with me. He could be the right-handed DH on opening day. It's not, impossible. And like you said, or it could be in May, someone slides into Tomas Nido and he gets hurt and he needs to go on the IL for a couple weeks. And then Alvarez comes up and mashes and just never goes back. Baty, I think, is probably slated for AAA with Eduardo Escobar kind of entrenched at third base. Like, that's solid defense, solid clubhouse, solid offensive output. Like, everything kind of checks the boxes there with Escobar. And at the end of the day, Baty only had 6 games of AAA experience before getting called up kind of out of necessity. So I would guess he spends the most time in AAA this year, followed by Alvarez, and then obviously Senga is going to be in the rotation. So I lean Senga, but you can definitely convince me that Francisco Alvarez comes up at some point in this year and just absolutely lights the league on fire.
Absolutely. You just never know. I mean, you look at the Braves. I don't think they expected Michael Harris to be a key contributor to the team, let alone winning the National League Rookie of the Year. And you never want to always point to what the Braves young players have done, but that goes to show you that sometimes the light just goes on differently for certain guys. And I think if we were having this conversation 1 year ago from today about Alvarez, and we were asked, when do you think Alvarez will come up and make an impact? If we were asked that 1 year ago today, Joe, I don't think either of us would say from opening day 2023. I think we would have, and especially you, because you are more balanced with prospects, and I think have you give more of a timeline because I think you understand where their deficiencies lie. We wouldn't have said Alvarez is going to need more time, not at the outset of his 21-year-old season. But who knows?
I thought, like you said, if we go back a year ago today, so we're in last offseason, I would have said it would be really awesome if Alvarez could be ready by mid-2023. And he made his debut in 2022. That just shows how fantastic of a season he had. And
3 levels of baseball.
Crazy at his age, at his position. And he caught the big leaguers like Scherzer and DeGrom and Trevor May on rehab. They made it a point to make sure that those guys threw to Alvarez as part of his development as well as their rehab. So yeah, Alvarez is a special, unique talent that the Mets, I think, need to be very smart about how they handled this next year for him. Because you don't want to put the, I guess, need at the big league level over his long-term development, because if you develop as a catcher to become average at the position, let's just call it that, he doesn't need to be a Gold Glover. You're talking about a guy that could be one of the top 3 to 5 most valuable catchers in the sport, given his offensive output. So I would play the long game with Alvarez, but I guess I'd understand if they kind of, wanted to put that bat in the lineup.
All right, Joe, episode 41. Before we close out, I'll put you on the spot for one thing. In an offseason where the unpredictable has happened, the predictable has happened, we've seen it all. What do you think the next move is? It doesn't have to be the very next move, because that could even be a minor league signing. But what do you think the move is that we're discussing at the top of next week's show?
Oh, man. I very much want it to be Michael Conforto. I think the bats are starting to move in this market. I think you're seeing those guys start to sign, and I think there's a market set for what JD Martinez and Justin Turner and Matt Carpenter, like these guys are all signing for give or take $10 to $12 million on a short-term commitment. I think that's setting a baseline for the Trey Mancinis, the Michael Confortos, and I think the Mets would be wise to not let that market pass them by. On the bullpen side, if you could trade for Liam Hendricks, go ahead. I'm all about it. Go get him. But if he's not moved or he's moved somewhere else, the bullpen free agent market is still so deep. Let that simmer, and you can wait. I want someone signed for 1 year and $3 million, just like Aaron Loop and Adam Ottavino, and get that premier value out of them. So you can wait on that, but I would be more aggressive on the offensive market. There's only a few guys left, and you can't let that market completely evaporate on you.
Well, Joe, it's funny you brought up Adam Ottavino, because while we're doing the show, what comes across the Twitter feed but the fact that he is back with the Mets on a 2-year deal. The contract details per Jeff Passan. It is a 2-year, $14.5 million agreement. The deal includes an opt-out after the first season for Ottavino, if he so pleases, I would assume, and a potential $1 million in performance bonuses each season. So we talked plenty about the idea of Hendricks, but now Ottavino back in the fold for a pretty significant trio at the top of this bullpen between Diaz, Robertson on the 1-year deal, and Ottavino, who had a great season for the Mets last year, now back with the team.
I mean, when I said the Mets could wait on the bullpen market, I meant just like 5 or 10 minutes. I didn't mean a month, so you all just took it wrong, I think. But this just adds more depth to this bullpen. Ottavino was fantastic here. He clearly meshed with the pitching coach, Jeremy Hefner, with the analytics staff here. I think everything worked out, and an older guy from the New York area, he probably didn't want to relocate, and he held firm on 2 years, and the Mets obviously are willing to do it. And, this shifts him down into that 7th inning kind of middle reliever role, with Robertson right now slated to be the 8th inning guy, bridge to Diaz. But who knows? Maybe Liam Hendricks is still on the table. Like, maybe now that is a deal where it kind of has to be money going that way. So maybe it is Carrasco and something for Hendricks. Like, maybe the Mets are trying to build a super bullpen, which isn't really my preferred method of doing things. We've talked about that a lot, but a good move bringing Ottavino back. I think about $7 million a year is pretty fair value for him. And yeah, I think it's a good looking move for the Mets to just increase the depth in that bullpen.
It always felt like Ottavino was very happy to be back where he's from, so it made sense for a reunion here. He gets the 2 years he was holding out for. This deal essentially replaces what the Trevor May deal was on the Mets payroll, so nothing jarring there. Somebody who was extremely effective for the Mets. Pitched in 66 games, 2.06 ERA. Ottavino is a big piece of this bullpen, and like you said, Joe, maybe not a more limited role, but maybe a less stressful role, barring an injury here, an injury there. And it's great to have that kind of depth in the bullpen. So with that being said, here on the Mets Pod, we want to wish everybody a happy holidays. And I have to give an apology. I lied last week. I said we will be here every single week. We are finally going to take 1 week off. We are very proud of our usual perfect attendance. But during the week between Christmas and New Year's, we will not be recording an episode of the Mets Pod, which means right after the new year, we will have a lot to catch up on, knowing that the rate this franchise moves at in the offseason. So we look forward to rejoining you then. Thanks so much, everybody, for the support, the mailbag questions. We greatly appreciate it, and I can't emphasize enough. Have a very, very happy holidays. And one more reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, to watch on SNY's YouTube, or wherever you get your shows. Thanks so much, and we'll talk to you soon.